New York, Friday, May 14, 1948. The United Nations General Assembly is in special session. Opposing the United Nations' decision to partition Palestine are the Arab states led by Syria's Faris el-Khoury. The Jewish representatives on the other side are waiting for their hour of destiny. The minutes of Britain's mandate are ticking to an end, but the 58 member nations are still deliberating over the future of the Holy Land. Here is Malek of Lebanon, who wants the United Nations to keep hands off. Cadogan of Great Britain and Trigvalee, there is no decision even as the deadline runs out. But in Tel Aviv, for the Jews of Palestine, it is a time for decision, a time to mold history for themselves. A new nation is being born. In the first Jewish city, Tel Aviv, their first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, proclaims the independent Jewish state. British rule is at an end.
We are excited to have with us on the show Jennifer Jajeh, who is a Palestinian rights activist who lives here in Los Angeles, and she is also a comedian and actor. I've invited her on to talk a little bit about what it's like to live in the West Bank, to grow up Palestinian, and some of the issues that she's faced just trying to get her voice heard. Welcome, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to have you. So we originally met because you were doing a live show with Ron Placone, and I remember speaking with you briefly at that show and hearing from you that your parents were from the West Bank and Palestine. And so I'd like to actually start the show off with you maybe explaining for folks. Now, imagine most Americans don't ever get to hear from an actual Palestinian that's lived these experiences. And I think there's value in it if people can hear just straight from the source what it's like to have gone through these things and to still be dealing with some of the outcomes of that. So your parents lived there in the West Bank and they experienced what we would call the Nakba firsthand. So the Nakba is basically loosely translates into the catastrophe. And this is when the Irgun, the Haganah, the Stern Gang, other Jewish paramilitary groups came in and basically vacated the land through acts of terrorism. So walk us through a little bit of what you have learned from your parents in regards to that and what that was like for them.
Well, this is the thing. It was very much, so the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, which was basically this decision on the parts of foreign entities to carve up Palestine into several different states. And so initially it was supposed to be two states, which was kind of like, oh, we'll just do a land transfer. Like you people move over there and you move over there. And then you guys can each have, and it's like, oh, wait, I'm supposed to give up.
That's just such a British colonial attitude to begin with, right? Right from the get-go, right from the jump.
Right. Yes. Just pick up and move to another part of the country and reestablish your entire life. And that makes everything okay. That we were, complicit in the Holocaust. So, and so essentially, this resulted in armed violence on the part of several, Jewish gangs that came, and they had several specific incidents of massacres and depopulating villages, basically killing everyone in the village and leaving one or two people alive to say, hey, go to the next village and spread the word that if they don't vacate, that's going to be happening to them. And so this is how, this is the founding of the Jewish state, and also what Palestinians deem as the catastrophe, the Nakba, as you said. And so my parents grew up in the West Bank in Ramallah. Both of them are from the same town. And Ramallah was not, the West Bank at this point was not captured and occupied until 1967. And so it was a kind of an in-between time. My parents were very young. They were in their early teens. Their families were quite scared. Our property in different parts of what was now becoming Israel, like we had orchards in Jaffa, and we had different properties in different parts of the country. And so those were now being usurped. And And so it was just this chaotic time in the early 50s when my family didn't know what was going to happen. And there was this fear and this threat that the Israeli military forces would be coming into the West Bank and taking over the rest of, the West Bank forcefully in the same way, potentially, with massacres as they did in 48. And so at this point, I think my family at the time said, you know what, why don't we go out of Palestine for a while, let things cool down, and we'll be back. And so my grandfather, who had basically been going back and forth to the US working already in the 30s and 40s, brought the family over. And what happened is that they were never allowed to return.
That's right. So the Palestinians that were displaced in 1948 have never been given the right of return. And I think importantly, if you choose to leave, even now, the occupied West Bank, they're not going to let you come back.
They make it very difficult to come back.
Well, yeah. And they've continued the settler program. So the illegal settlements in the West Bank, as we speak, are expanding. And right now, the current uproar surrounds the annexation of East Jerusalem and some of the Palestinians that are being currently displaced there. So I don't know that folks understand what happens here. So basically what happens is these settlers show up, they decide they're taking your house, your family house from you, and they take it by hook or by crook, right?
Jacob, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
it's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
Yeah, you are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, يا عمي.
Right? And I think it's not as if there's an option here. This is not a real estate transaction where folks are selling their houses to these settlers. They're having their houses stolen from them. And surrounding that has been a lot of settler violence. A lot of, these are groups of folks that are very much hard right, almost fascist, nationalist in the way they perceive Zionism, right? So now you went back to the West Bank. Did you go back to Ramallah in the early 2000s?
Yes, I was in Ramallah in 2000.
And
I lived there.
Like?
Well, it was interesting. There's a few things I want to clarify. Like,
okay.
I went there in 2000 to, it was right when there was this kind of illusion that there was going to be a Palestinian state announced, and that the two-state solution would actually be implemented. And so there were a lot of Palestinians from abroad who were coming there to live, to start businesses, to reestablish themselves, because they thought if there's going to be a Palestinian state, we want to be on the ground so that we don't get, again, kicked out and unable to return to Palestine. Right. And
so this was post-Oslo Accords then, basically?
Yeah, this was in mid-2000, the summer of 2000.
Okay.
And so there was a lot of reinvestment in the West Bank. A lot of Palestinians from abroad were financially investing, creating businesses, building tons of hotels and infrastructure, starting companies. And it was a really exciting time when I got there. And very quickly, by September, I believe it was late September, is when the Intifada started as a result of course, the Israeli leader at the time decided to go, to start, to create some sort of on the ground violence by entering the mosque and Al-Aqsa and compound. And so it's this constant instigation, which is then put onto the Palestinians as creating violence or escalating violence, when it's usually a provocation, like stealing someone's home, and for the Israeli Supreme Court to decide, yes, it is actually fine for these settlers to take these homes of these people. And so when Palestinians then react to the inequities, the injustices that are being foisted upon them, then it's like, then the media and the PR machine gears up to, call this, oh, Palestinians are protesting violently and there are clashes and, and so we forget the instigating incidents and we focus in the West, especially on the resulting, protests.
Right.
And so that is something that was very clear to me when I was on the ground and I would go to protests, in terms of then later that day getting on the internet and watching the coverage, being like, wait a second, they never mentioned the inciting incident of blocking blocking access to universities, and then students are protesting and then they start shooting, and and so it's like, oh well, these students are hurling rocks at the military for no reason, and so then it's framed in this way. And so I think that's the one thing I learned on the ground. But the second thing I learned on the ground is that even during the 3 months that I was there for several years, but the first 3 months were quite peaceful, quote unquote, in terms of everything was being put into motion to establish this Palestinian state. And even during peaceful times, there were limitations, there were checkpoints, there were villages being destroyed, there were home demolitions, there were, arrests with no basis and no sort of legal system in place to actually have anyone get any justice or be able to even, people get arrested and never get to speak to a lawyer, never get to see their family.
Well, that's actually, Jennifer, that's a really salient point, because I don't think a lot of Americans realize this. When you're in the occupied West Bank, if you are a Palestinian in that area, you don't have access to the Israeli court system. What you are tried and punished under is military law, which is an entirely different thing. So that is one form of apartheid, in my opinion.
The other thing is that they've carved up the West Bank. In Gaza and the West Bank are on, and they do this purposely. They have created all of these differentiations and variations of rights and systems that you have access to and that you are tried under.
H1,
so
H2, these different zones. Yeah.
So they create these different zones. In at that time, I think it was Zone A, Zone B, Zone C. Now it's something else. It's constantly evolving, but this is under just Palestinian jurisdiction. This is under only Israeli jurisdiction. This is the gray zone. But even things under Palestinian jurisdiction is what I realized on the ground. That is a false claim that there is anything under Palestinian jurisdiction.
No, it's all military occupation.
Because it's completely occupied. There's a Palestinian, police force that stands around, pretending that holding guns and trained by Israel and acting as if they're in charge for what's going on. But anytime Israel decides, hey, we don't like what's going on over here, we're going in to arrest somebody, we're going into, erect a new checkpoint, we're going into, do random house arrests or demolitions or dropping a bomb on somebody's house. They don't care if it's under Palestinian jurisdiction. So I think what you really learn when you're on the ground is that all of these, logistics and talking points and are all false flags. It's a brutal, ongoing apartheid situation, a military occupation where people are subjugated, are treated like not even second-class citizens, third, fourth, fifth-class citizens that have no rights, that have no access. And the expectation that people are going to happily live under these conditions is ridiculous. Is asinine.
It is asinine. I mean, an oppressed people will fight back. That is just not a crazy statement.